No negotiation. Nothing short of complete victory over the enemy.
D-Day. This was the day when the armed forces of Britain, America and their allies began the liberation of Europe, which had been occupied by Germany. During the 1930s, Germany had built up its army, navy and air force very rapidly, despite having agreed not to do this after the First World War. The other European countries did not wish to go to war, but Germany's leader, Adolf Hitler, became more and more aggressive and demanded land from neighboring countries. Reluctantly, the European nations built up their military forces. But this did not prevent Germany from annexing Austria and Czechoslovakia and making alliances with Italy, Russia and Japan. In September 1939, Germany attacked Poland, at which point France, Britain and the British Empire declared war on Germany. The Germans went on rapidly to defeat and occupy Poland, followed shortly by Holland, Belgium, France, Greece and Yugoslavia. The Germans were able to put huge amounts of pressure on Great Britain by bombing British cities and by sinking British and Allied ships in the Atlantic.
And the many peoples of the empire sprang to answer the call for service in the cause of liberty and justice. The men from Canada, from New Zealand, from Australia, from South Africa, and many others fell in, and the empire marches.
The Caribbean islands, such as Jamaica, all joined the war and provided troops and equipment, making the Allied forces a truly multicultural alliance. In 1940, Britain faced invasion, but British fighters defeated German air power in the Battle of Britain, and Hitler cancelled his plans. In 1941, following their success in Western Europe, the Germans turned on the Russians, broke their alliance with them, and invaded. Up to this stage, the world's richest nation, the United States of America, had stayed isolated from the conflict, although they clearly felt that Britain and its allies were in the right, and provided resources, loans, and unofficial encouragement to Britain.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well.
In December 1941, Germany's ally Japan, suddenly and without warning, attacked the United States Navy base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Americans immediately declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. Heavy fighting was now taking place across a large part of the world, in Europe, Africa, and Asia, with Australasia and North America also involved. The Americans were able to throw new resources into the war and began to make an impact. In North Africa, the Germans were gradually defeated, and in 1943, the Allies invaded Italy. The Germans were now fighting to their east and south, although they still had a firm grip in the west of Europe. The Allies knew they had to break this grip, and so, with great secrecy, they planned to invade and liberate first France and then the rest of the continent. By June 1944, they were ready.
This is London. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European forces. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This is the year 1944. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory.
The invasion was given a secret code name, Operation Overlord, and needed a huge amount of planning and preparation. The first thing the Allies had to decide was whereabouts in France they would land. It came down to a choice between the area known as the Pas-de-Calais or the region of Normandy. Normandy was chosen. The beaches where the British and Canadian troops would land were codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Americans would land on Utah and Omaha beaches. In overall charge of D-Day was the American General Eisenhower, while the man in charge of all the land forces was the British General Montgomery. The two men are pictured here with some of their fellow generals on the embroidery at the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth, which was made to commemorate the D-Day landings. Eisenhower, Montgomery, and their staff worked for months drawing up the secret plans for D-Day, which would involve hundreds of thousands of men and women, thousands of tanks, ships, and aircraft, and millions of tons of food, ammunition, and equipment. All this time, the Germans knew that the Allies would invade France, but they did not know where or when. One of Germany's greatest generals, Field Marshal Rommel, was put in charge of building a huge system of defenses known as the Atlantic Wall along the north coast of France. The Atlantic Wall included heavy guns as well as minefields and barbed wire, and there were thousands of metal and concrete obstacles on the beaches to make it harder for Allied tanks and landing craft to come ashore. But still, they did not know when the invasion would come. They had to wait and watch. Back in Britain, Eisenhower conferred with the Allied generals for the last time. The very bad weather had held up the entire invasion, but by early June it had improved. Now Eisenhower, with the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, decided that this was their only chance. D-Day was scheduled for June the 5th, 1944. Everyone made their final preparations. All the soldiers, sailors, and airmen were briefed by their officers. Finally, all the equipment, the tanks, and the soldiers embarked onto the ships to take them across the Channel to France. Many men spent a long time aboard these ships. Some of them spent the time reading a book they had all been given, telling them about France and its people. The weather was terrible, and D-Day was cancelled for 24 hours. Many of the men waiting in ships suffered severe seasickness. Some of them would later say that when they got to France, they were no longer afraid of being killed. They were just grateful to be back on dry land. Eisenhower decided that D-Day would have to go ahead on June the 6th. If he postponed it any longer, he would have to wait another 2 weeks before the tides were right again. He visited some of his troops and wished them good luck. The very first Allied troops to arrive in France were not, however, waiting in ships. These were the British and American airborne forces, men who went in by gliders or by parachute to carry out important missions behind the German lines. Men of the British 6th Airborne Division landed near the town of Caen to capture some important objectives, while the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed on the Cherbourg Peninsula. For the British, it was vital that the Pegasus and Horsa bridges over the River Orne and Caen Canal were captured intact. They were the only places between the town of Caen and the sea where the canal and the river could be crossed, and were needed to allow the British troops landing on Sword Beach to move inland.
Stuff was handed out to blacken the faces. When we arrived, there was 6 Halifaxes and 6 gliders on the runways waiting to take off.
We wandered around, chatted with our mates,
made a few goodbyes, you know. The atmosphere to me, it was strange. It was as though, although I was there, I was sort of not involved in it.
The soldiers who arrived by glider landed on French soil a few minutes after midnight on the morning of D-Day, near the Pegasus Bridge. The gliders had swooped silently in towards their landing points to catch the Germans by surprise and capture the bridges before the defenders could raise the alarm.
We knew that once we'd cast off from the coast from the Halifax bombers that were towing us, it would be 7 minutes gliding in. When they did the last right-hand turn, which was down parallel between the canal and the river, he saw the bridge. The drill when you come into land is you link arms with the man either side of you. In my case it was Den Brothers, the platoon commander, on one side, and you do a butcher's grip with your fingers. You lift your legs and you just pray to God your number isn't up, and that's all you can do. You're entirely in the hands of those glider pilots.
The men who piloted the gliders had a difficult job. They had to make sure they landed in exactly the right place in the dark, and they had to land without doing too much damage to the men being carried in the glider. Other airborne soldiers parachuted from aeroplanes. Jumping out of an aeroplane in the dark was a frightening experience.
I can remember vividly the coloured flak coming up. Streams of yellow, streams of green, and it looked sort of like a firework display.
When I jumped, I had the clear impression that an shell had exploded near the tail of the aircraft, because I didn't really jump, I was thrown out of the aircraft, thank goodness, because the decision was taken away from me.
When I hit the deck, and I was the only one there, I don't know where the others had gone, and I could hear the lead and the ack flying around, and then I looked up and there's a massive big white horse there. And being born and bred in Manchester and not with 5 miles of a horse, I thought, how the hell do I get past this thing? And that occupied me in the middle of the battlefield.
Thousands of troops now landed by glider and gave their support to capture some heavy German guns known as the Merville Battery.
When I was given the task of capturing the Merville Battery, early in 1944, I realized it was going to be a very complicated operation and a very tough one. We were jumping over the Atlantic Wall in order to land outside another fortress. And we were going to